Monday, 19 April 1852. Will is a nuisance most of the time, but he does make me laugh. He came out of his bed this morning in a raring mood, all set to tear into something if it so much as stepped in his way. I happened to be the one in his way, and quite purposely so. It's been deadly dull around here for days, and I could do with amusement. He had picked up a stick and was thumping it against the fence around Mother's garden simply to hear the noise. I snatched it away from him and held it out of his reach, and he jumped for it just as a dog might. Then he set his fists on his hips, and widened his eyes and puckered his lips in such a perfect imitation of Nursey when she's fighting mad that I laughed out loud, which only made him more furious. I threw the stick so he could fetch it before he moved those fists away from his hips and toward mine. This afternoon went back to dullness until Father's new overseer arrived. His name is Joe Green, and I accompanied him and Father on his tour of Sweet Afton. Dante was glad of the ride, though I couldn't let him run as we'd both like. He could do with a few practice turns, but I dare say he'll beat little Andy Hopkins' gray gelding on Saturday in any case. One thing I did notice about Joe Green was the way Webb acted around him. Seems to me he's a fair indication of what all the others are thinking, so I can judge their mood by what I see him do and what little Henry says he does, though Henry's been talking less and less about what goes on in the cabins lately. As we were passing by them planting in the east field, I turned back in the saddle to see Webb standing there tall and straight while the rest were hunched over and busy. He was watching our backs with a worried or maybe sad expression on his face. When he saw I was watching him back, he smiled like he hadn't been thinking a thing, and turned again to his work. Father says Joe Green has a reputation as a fair man. I wonder if the slaves have heard of that same reputation. It was a nice room in its time, and elegantly furnished, for this part of Ohio anyway, with a great canopied bed high enough off the floor that Anna Lee, Tom, and Rebecca had to climb the posts as children to get onto it. A fairy palace or Rapunzel's tower on rainy days, the bed was the only thing in the house that had been forbidden to them. Naturally, the relic from Grandfather's move from his place of prominence in Boston became a favorite destination for dolls on a pilgrimage through the house. It was the celestial city and a clearing in Sherwood Forest rolled into one. Here the children would have tea and cakes and gloom over the tribulations Christian had endured in his quest to reach this field of white. Then, when that became a bore, the girls would regale Robin with tales of their encounters with Nottingham, and prove that Maid Marian and her nurse were as adept at daring-do as any merry man. Yet these selfsame Amazons and the noble thief would scatter at the sound of a hefty Yorkshire housekeeper, or worse yet, the sight of an Ohio doctor's tiny wife. Now the children's playroom had become a sick room where, more often than not, Annalie sewed or embroidered, or read from the volumes of Shakespeare her father so cherished, or simply listened to her older sister breathe those shallow, labored breaths that sometimes made Annalie dread spending her mornings inside. Her sister's bad days were much more tolerable when Rebecca was awake, for then Annalie could read aloud and concentrate on giving personality to the characters on her imaginary stage by pitching her voice higher or lower than normal. When Rebecca slept, Annalie had time to wonder how much longer it would be before she became an only child. Of course, to be perfectly honest, she was an only natural-born child, at least for her mother. But Mama had never made any distinction between the little girl and boy she had gained when she married Papa and the child she bore a year later. She certainly carried on after Tom, as though he'd come from her blood and flesh instead of from another woman, whom neither of them had ever met, and whom Rebecca remembered only vaguely. Just that morning she had lapsed into one of her states again, after having done so well for the past week. That seemed to be the way of it. Her turns came with Rebecca's. Annalie had come upon her where Papa's orchard met the fence surrounding the pasture, turning the soil that bordered the freshly painted rails all along the north section, preparing the beds there for her annuals to just out of reach of the horses' mouths. Annalie's own horse, Benedict, stood watching her work, occasionally arching his neck down to nibble at clover, as though to say he didn't want any of her nasty flowers anyway. Her mother must have heard his disdain in the slight snort he gave, for she turned toward him and stroked a reconciliatory hand over his muzzle. That was her way. The living things of this world were made right under her hand. She could transform the puniest of cuttings into a mighty giant of blossoms. She had even restored order to the roses the first Mrs. Warner had started at the gazebo behind the house, resurrecting them after years of neglect had left the stems to gnarl and choke each other so that the gazebo might have been part of Sleeping Beauty's palace, surrounded by an impenetrable thicket of brambles. Perhaps it was this gift of life that made her so unable to bear that Tom had been beyond her power to save. "I left your breakfast on the table," Mamma had said as she sat back on her heels and pushed the framing folds of her bonnet away from her face. "I thought perhaps you could eat later than the rest of us, provided you spared Mrs. Dow the cleaning up after you." Annalee had grinned at the indulgent admonition. "I will, Mamma." "What was it that kept you?" "I saw a new forsythia in bloom." "Ah, planning to sketch it?" "And stitch it." Mamma bent again with her hands in the dirt. Gloved hands, for though she cherished the glorious rich heaviness of freshly turned soil slipping through bare fingers, she knew too what trouble it was to dig the remnants out of one's fingernails before going out into society. "It would make a lovely trim for a dress." "Oh, yes, you will need a new dress at that. Mrs. Hardy came calling just before I started out here." Mamma laughed. "That woman! My bread was barely down my throat, she came so early this morning. And what did she want, you might ask? Simply to tell me of a ball for her Matthew 3 months in advance. She's already had the gallery set up for the musicians. I asked her why the hurry, and she said, 'I want to be ready to move up the ball in case he decides to come home early.'" "If he comes home at all," Annalee said. "Knowing him, he'll latch onto one of those philosophers they read at those schools and head off to England or France to tour the places where they once slept. Can you imagine Matthew Hardy reading philosophy?" Of course, Mamma had chuckled, for while it may have seemed possible to imagine him reading, no one in the county might have imagined him becoming useful as a result. Matthew Hardy, a philosopher! Tom will have a good laugh at that when he gets home. Without a pause, but with only a slight tightening of her fist, Annalee had replied, "Yes, he will, Mamma." And so it went with Mamma. She would not have a day without the sure conviction that Tom would be coming down the road any time now, never mind that she herself had chosen the epitaph for his tombstone. Now Annalee glanced up from the waistcoat she was finishing, with embroidered fleur-de-lis for Papa. He would be home soon, his letter had promised. And she concentrated on measuring the breaths Rebecca took as she stirred in her sleep. They were still regular, and would remain so for another hour, until the laudanum passed sufficiently through her body to allow her to wake on her own. How loathsome Annalee found the stuff, syrupy sweet smell, and ever encased in a dark brown bottle through which no light could pass. She supposed it was an appropriate fixture of a sick room, which made it all the more hateful. Her papa was a doctor, and she had seen too many sick rooms to need one for her own sister. The world should have done away with shutting up the sick long ago, and let them enjoy open air and sunny days while they still could. Annalee pushed the thought from her mind. With Papa and John back home, of course Rebecca would live to see many a sunny day to come. She remembered instead how her sister had been wont to spend every spare moment outside, how she still stole out on her good days, and how particularly the gazebo and its associated rose-tending duties had drawn her presence. Those were the days when she would help Mamma prune back the strays, train the runners, or cut the most perfect flowers to bring into the house. There had been times when, as a small child, Annalee had seen her spend a whole hour just sitting and breathing in the flowers' fragrance. The Warner children had always shared their parents' love of all things floral. Even Tom, who had taken time out of his gallivanting with Sam or the Dow brothers to pick bouquets of wildflowers to set in a tin drinking cup alongside the elegant vase of roses in the parlor, just to keep the roses from thinking they were better than everybody else, he'd said. Annalee tended to prefer wildflowers too, and shrubs and vines, and most other plants that grew in the woods. They needed no special attention, no pains to keep them in good health. They stood through most weather, the trees providing them with all the shelter they might need, and they were strong, bending when a cultivated flower might break. Sometimes Annalie longed to throw great handfuls of wildflower seeds over the grounds of Oakshade, to watch them blanket the place in color and show the dowdy, oversweet hyacinths in Mamma's garden what flowers ought to be. She longed to spin and spin in amongst them until she was drunk with color and must fall down to lie with them. One need never fear to tread through wildflowers. At the sound of metal on wood and hooves on ground, she looked out the window to watch the travelers come up the long driveway. John sat on a horse a few inches taller than the ones pulling her father's buggy. It fit its rider well. Papa had said when he first met his future son-in-law that he was a head taller than any man in all of Ohio. Annalie didn't know about that, but she did know he had the kindest disposition of any man, save her papa, and so she didn't care that she almost had to leap up to kiss his cheek. She considered waking Rebecca to welcome them home, but thought perhaps she might be happier to wake under John's hand. So she folded the waistcoat, placed it in the chair, and opened the bedroom door. Rebecca's little daughter Lucy met her there in the hall, dragging her doll behind her by one braid. "Your father's home," Annalie said. The child clapped her hands, the doll's face coming up unheeded between them, and let out a slight, high-pitched squeal. "Pappy!" Annalie came to the top of the stairs in time to see John spinning with his daughter under one arm and his valise in his other hand. He stopped when he saw Annalie. "I think Grandpa has a surprise for you in his bag," John said as he put Lucy down. Her eyes widened, and she ran outside. Annalie's smile couldn't be as broad or as genuine as she would have liked as John ascended the stairs, but she could hardly laugh with the report she had to give him. He stopped 2 steps below her so she could almost meet his eyes. "Rebecca's in her room?" Annalie nodded. "It's spread, John, to her lungs. She's been coughing up blood." He stared at her for a moment and swallowed. "For how long?" "Not long." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck as though he had been bent too long over a book. "She had a bad time of it last night. I gave her a little too much laudanum, but the regular amount didn't seem to work. And I know I'm not supposed to, but I gave Mama a little to calm her nerves." He nodded. "I suppose it was best." Annalie studied him for a moment as he stared at a spot on the carpet as though it might tell him what to do next. "Go on up. She's been waiting for a long time."